Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Thanks for being part of our community. My name is Valen Kolika, and I will be your host for today. Just a few reminders before we kick off the session. If at any time you experience issues viewing the stream and are using the web browser version of Teams, please refresh your browser. If you're using the desktop app of Teams, please exit and rejoin. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. We will post the recording on our community at aka.ms/security-webinars. Closed captions in several languages are available during the live broadcast, and you can enable them by clicking on the CC button located at the lower right corner of your screen. Feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the live event Q&A window, simply by clicking on the Ask a Question button. Please be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. However, if you prefer, you can post your question anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter it. Now, we often get many questions on these webinars, and we'll do our best to respond to all of them in real time. In the event if the answer was not provided, or if you may have additional questions post this event, please don't hesitate to raise them on our Azure Security Center forum at aka.ms/ASC community. If you're listening to this after the fact as a recording, that's also a great place to ask a question. And we love to hear your feedback on how we can improve these webinars, so please do so at aka.ms/security webinar feedback. I would like to invite you to join our public community by visiting aka.ms/security community. That's the best way to ensure that you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements. On our community, you can speak directly to our engineering teams that create our security products. You'll be able to influence our product designs and get early access to changes by doing things like participating in a private preview, which, by the way, you can sign up at aka.ms/securityprp. You can request features, you can give feedback, review our product roadmaps, register for events, or join webinars like this. We believe that the best way to improve our products is by removing any barriers between you and the people that create them. So we hope you'll join us. In today's session, Nicholas DiCola and Tom Janetscheck will be guiding us through the variety of Azure Security Center automation options and sharing some automation tips based on logic apps, workflow automation, REST APIs, continuous export, as well as KQL. Tom is a senior program manager with the Azure Security Center team, whereas Nick is a principal director of our customer experience engineering team. And without further ado, I will turn it over to them. Please, Tom, Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Valon, and welcome everybody to today's session about automated security with Azure Security Center. Today we're going to talk, and that is what Valon already introduced you to, about all the automation capabilities that we have in ASC and how you can leverage them when it comes to protecting your environment. And yeah, before we start, I want to make you aware of the fact that we are using PaulEV today to get some insights into your challenges that you might be facing when it comes to protecting your environment using automations. And so please go to paulev.com/TomJanich E217, and you'll be able to join the conversation directly, and we will see the live results later on the slides. First of all, we're going to take a little overview look to what CSPM and CWPP actually are when it comes to working with Azure Security Center. And then we will go over to the REST APIs, continuous export, workflow automation, and all the other interesting automation capabilities that we have. We will spice it up with some demos, and at the end of the session, we will open it up for a Q&A and answer some questions that might be unanswered. So first of all, we want to know where you are joining us from today. And as you can see, I'm joining from Germany, and we have some folks on the team joining from the United States and from Ireland and from so on. So yeah, we're looking forward to learning a little bit more about where you all are coming from. We know we have a light delay in the live Teams event, so it might take some minutes, some seconds until we will see the results here.
You know, I'm looking forward to Paul Evie's new feature when you click on the map to show the flag of the country. That would be cool.
That would be nice, yeah, absolutely. There's quite a lot of countries that we see here, so that would be interesting to learn even more when we see the flags. I'm not sure if the answers are coming in. Do you see them in the backend?
Yeah, they're coming in. There's a slight delay.
Okay.
There's also a couple comments in the chat. Looks like we got India, Texas, Indiana, Israel.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, welcome everybody.
Welcome. Okay, let's move on to the next question. And the question is, what is your role in your organization? We have that question to find out what audience we have today and to see what might be the most interesting part when it comes to enabling automation. And I see we have cloud security engineers on top of the list at the moment. Well, that's interesting. Looks like cloud security engineers are winning.
I was going to say I see a couple more countries in the chat, UK, Spain, France. So definitely a blend of countries, which is awesome.
Nice. All right, you'll be able to still answer this question, so I'll just move forward in the favor of time. But thank you for providing us with all the insights. That's pretty good. Thank you. So when it comes to talking about Azure Security Center, we basically cover two main pillars, which is Cloud Security Posture Management, or CSPM, and the Cloud Workload Protection Capability, or CWPP. Now, first of all, let's take a little look at Cloud Security Posture Management and what we can do when it comes to enabling automation with that. So as you might know, one of the main dashboards in Azure Security Center is the recommendations view with the secure score on top of the list and information about security controls, about security recommendations, and about the maximum secure score, the current secure score that you might have, and so on and so forth. Now, why is that important? Well, because secure score is considered as being the main security KPI that shows how you're doing in protecting your environment. And all that information that you're seeing here can later be exposed by different means, by, for example, the APIs, or using PowerShell to trigger to pull that information. You can use a variety of other things, and that is what we're talking about today. But what you can still think of is that everything that you see here in terms of data that is relevant for your environment, that is something that you can use within the scope of automation. And I mentioned that secure score is your main security KPI. The idea of secure score is that once you start with having a particular secure score, you want to make sure that your secure score is raising, and a secure score of 100% would be the best for your environment, because then you could make sure, or you would know, that all your security issues when it comes to configuring an environment have been solved, and that your environment is as protected as it could be. That means that once the secure score goes up, the number of open recommendations will drop and your security posture is automatically enhanced. But still, you need to take care of governance, because if you do not, your secure score will drop again. And that is not only a number that will drop, but it will also show that your security posture is no longer as good as it used to be. That could happen, for example, if you create new resources that are not secure by default. For example, you might have a storage account that is created with a public-facing internet without authentication. Or you might have a virtual machine that is not protected with just-in-time VM access or by other means. So the management ports would be open to the internet. And since that would be an unsecure resource, your secure score will drop again. And as I said, it's not only a number, but it really indicates that there is something going on in your environment that is not good for your security. Now, before we dig into the demos and look what we can do with automation and CSPM, we have another question for you, and that is what are the main challenges around automating security posture management? So what is it what you are missing, what you might be missing, what you do not know? How can we help you automate security posture management in your environment? And as I said, we can basically use all the data that we have in Security Center. If it is about recommendations, if it is about secure score, the assessments information, that is everything that we can use in automations, and build automations around it. For example, also using policies to remediate at scale to make sure that no unsecure resources are deployed. And we want to know what the main challenges for you could be. There's quite a lot coming in. Thank you for that. I see some buzzwords like I've seen multi-cloud. Security portals, knowing visibility, okay. Wow, that's quite a lot what's coming in here. That's great. Keep it coming. That looks good. All right, we'll still have that answer open for you to give your, or that question open for you to give your answers. And then I'm giving it over to Nick, who will lead you through the CSPM capabilities and the rest of automation that we have.
Awesome, thanks, Tom. So some great questions in the chat so far. So I think we're answering some of those, which is awesome. But let's talk about cloud workload protection for a second. So the other part that Tom talked about for Azure Security Center is protecting your workloads once you've deployed them in the cloud from a threat detection capability, right? So as you have these workloads in the cloud, how do you know, even if you've maybe strengthened their posture and maybe there's just still a few open vulnerabilities you're working on, if they've actually been attacked, and then how to respond to those once you see that attack in your environment. So move forward, Tom. So in Azure Security Center, we have a nice Azure Defender security alerts blade where you can start to see all of these different type of attacks that might be occurring against your resources. And remember, Azure Security Center is not just Azure, as the name sounds, or Azure Defender. We do support multi-cloud, so you can now connect AWS and GCP and protect those workloads, as well as on-prem using Azure Arc. So you can get a good view across all of your different workloads in Azure on-prem and multi-cloud and get this threat protection capability. So in your security alerts there, you can see we have this like failed SSH brute force attack. And so over time, as you start to respond to these, we know more and more alerts are coming in. You know, the key is how can you automate them and make it easier for your SOC analysts. So as we move into one of these alerts and taking a deeper dive into it, we can see here some things such as it was the Contoso Linux VM, what subscription it sits in, and some information about the IPs. And we pull geo and threat intel information from our sources and share that with you as well so you can understand. And you can use that information in your automations, which we'll talk about today, to respond to these. And ultimately, maybe you go in and say, hey, I want to add to an NSG or network security group to block these IP addresses to make sure that attacker can no longer try to attack or SSH into your VM from those. Next slide. So here, the key thing is if you go ahead and click the animation, Tom, what we've added to the Azure Defender alerts is this capability to trigger a logic app. So we'll show you later, you can also trigger these automatically for certain alerts, but you can also trigger them manually. So you may want to have an analyst look at the alert first, determine some steps, and then trigger a certain playbook. And this playbook could be as simple as, send a message to a SOC team in Teams, or it could be open a ServiceNow ticket for tracking and incident management long-term. And it could also be go remediate and respond to the action, or go enrich and find out more information about these IP addresses. So there's lots of things you can do, but we make it super easy for you to trigger this manually. And then you can build automation, automatic remediation or response playbooks from that. So let's go to the next one. I think we have another poll. So kind of like the previous one, we'd love to hear if there's some challenges around automating response with cloud workload protection. So typically when there's a actual security alert. I'll check the chat for any questions while we're doing that. I see somebody from Virginia. That's where I'm from. Congrats. Welcome.
Yeah, later in the demo, we'll also talk about automating cloud workload protection. So I'm going to have a demo for one of the automations that we created in the team that will help you automatically react on an alert if it pops up, and that will basically block the alert once it occurs. But yeah, we are also interested in your ideas and what you're missing, and what is challenging for you to create an automation around all the alerts that we are generating in Azure Defender.
Yep. There's a great question here on cloud workload protection, which Stanislav is replying to, but says, does Azure Defender integrate with Defender for Endpoint? And so the answer is yes. We actually provide you Defender for Endpoint for all your server workloads integrated into Azure Defender. So you can just check a box to integrate those in your settings, and we will automatically enable Microsoft Defender for Endpoint on those server workloads. If you already are using it in your environment, it'll just connect to your existing Defender workspace. So great question. All right, let's go ahead and go to the next one in the time. All right, so let's talk about API options and the things that are available to use. So the cool thing about Azure and all of our services in Azure is they're all built on top of RESTful APIs. There's actually a public GitHub repo. You can actually view and see all of the different APIs for all of the different resource providers inside of Azure, but we're going to focus on Azure Security Center today. So first, there is a set of Azure Security Center REST APIs. So you can pull things like your secure score, you can pull assessments, which is your recommendations, you can pull all of the alerts. There's many of these, and we're going to provide you the link in the chat, and it'll also be in the deck afterwards that you can go look at the docs on these APIs. And you can see what you can pull from those APIs, as well as some of them allow configurations. So if you wanted to control, say, the pricing configurations of your subscriptions across all of your Azure subs, you could do that through the Azure Security Center REST API. And then we have a collective REST API called the Graph Security API. And so from here, you can pull secure score and alerts, but not just from Azure Security Center. You can also pull them from the other Microsoft security products. So things like Cloud App Security, Sentinel, Defender for Identity, and the secure score from both Azure and Microsoft Secure Score. So you can pull those down in one shot using that API. And then lastly, Azure Resource Graph. You can use this in the portal to query your resources, and specifically for Azure Security Center, all of the resources are listed under security resources, and you can see assessments and secure scores. But this gives you a query-like language that you can use, and it also has a REST API that you can run that query against, return that data back to whatever system you're trying to integrate with. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about dive a little bit into the Azure Security Center REST API. So you can see here, this is a screenshot of the actual page from the docs page. And Valen, if you can drop the link in chat so if folks want to look at that at the same time. Oh, you did, thank you. You can see there's various different things. So you can pull in things like adaptive application controls, alerts, allowed connections, assessments, all the way down to our IoT integration with Azure Defender for IoT. So all of those are available. You can click on each one of these documents and kind of see what's available there. And then we also have the link to the Security Graph API. Again, this is consolidated API for all the products and as well for the Azure Resource Graph. The nice thing about the Resource Graph is you have a little bit more query capability than you do in the other APIs. If you're familiar with OData, most REST APIs like Microsoft Security Graph support OData querying, which can be a little complex to write that query sometimes. So the Azure Resource Graph is kind of nice because if you know KQL querying, you can use that to query the Azure Resource Graph. Next slide. All right, so the steps to use the Azure Security Center API, and we're not going to go through all of these steps, but we'll show you a little bit of demo on how to use this with something like a tool like Postman. The first is to register an application in Azure Active Directory, assign RBAC permissions for that application to the desired scope. So specifically, when accessing most of the REST API, you need security readers. If you want to do some type of put or patch operation, which is typically a write operation, you will need a security admin. Then you will run a command to get an authentication token, and we'll show you this in Postman to pull the authentication token. And then you use that authentication token in any request to an endpoint, whether that's a get, put, delete, or patch. And then obviously that will return a response. If it's get, you'll typically get a JSON payload back with alerts or recommendations, whatever it is that you're pulling. Typically with a put, you'll get some type of response that it was successful and kind of a basic JSON of what was put into the system. Next slide. So some scenarios and when you might want to use these APIs and automations and things like that. And again, we're going to walk through quite a few of these in the demo here in a minute. But first, you may want to integrate with third-party applications. Specifically, I talked about or mentioned, you may want to open a ticket in ServiceNow. So we've seen customers that say, hey, when I get one of these recommendations, I want to open a ticket in ServiceNow. I then want to assign it to the app owner to go remediate their Azure resource. And hopefully, they take that remediation and add it back to their code. So the next time they deploy that application in the cloud, it's already protected. You may want to run a one-time script. Maybe there's a question that needs to be answered and you might say, hey, I need to pull all the alerts in the last day and just see how many are running or coming in the last day or last 7 days, or maybe I want to analyze that data further in something like Excel. You might have scheduled automations to pull out the data. For example, we have a really good sample of using this in our GitHub, where you can pull out the secure score data on a daily basis and then build a nice Power BI report so you can track and trend your secure score over time. And then we talked about triggered automations, and obviously the nice thing about automation is there's so many things you can do, and so there's many more scenarios that you might need to do that or use automation for. Sorry. Next slide. All right, so Tom's going to demo the Postman collection, but specifically we have a nice document that shows how to use Postman to walk through and connect to the Azure REST APIs, and I believe Valen has dropped that in chat as well. But we'll go ahead and flip over to the demo. Go to the next slide, Tom.
Yep.
And Tom's going to walk you through using Postman to access the Azure Security Center APIs.
Right, thank you. So yeah, let me just go to Postman, and you have seen a screenshot of that just before on the slides. So what we will do now is we will pull some information from our Azure Security Center REST APIs, but not only from them. You also see I have prepared some post requests for the Azure Resource Graph, because Azure Resource Graph also comes with its own REST API, and you can leverage that to push some query information to the API and then get the response. So I will show you that in a minute. If we go to the AAC alerts, what I've already done is the authentication part. So what you have seen in the steps on the slides was that you have to create a managed identity or an application in Azure Active Directory that will get access to a subscription or a resource group or a management group, because without that, you won't have access to any information that you could retrieve from the APIs. So I have done that already. And if we just now run a GET request against the Microsoft.security/alerts provider, then you will get all the alerts in my particular subscription right now. And as Nick already said, that is a JSON format that is coming back, and you can work with that information in your automations. So you can use the APIs in your self-developed applications to work with the information that is coming there, and you can also put or post some information against some APIs. For example, to set some settings. If you want to manage Azure Security Center, you can do that using the settings API, for example. Then we have the, yeah, please.
Can I just add one little tidbit here? So if you note in the path of the URL, he's calling subscriptions/subscription ID. Every one of Azure Security Center APIs is at the subscription level because you enable Azure Security Center at the subscription level. So you always call that subscription. Just remember that in case you have multiple subscriptions and you want to pull alerts, you'll basically have to enumerate and loop through those.
That's correct. Yeah, and basically what I did is I have created a variable in which I put my subscription ID into, but that could also contain a set of subscription IDs. And then if you would loop through that, you would get all the information for all of your subscriptions, of course. But yeah, thank you for that hint. That is a good one. Then we have the Secure Scores API. You see here Microsoft.security/secure scores, and the result you're getting here is the secure score for your particular subscription. So you see that there is a maximum secure score of 56 points on the particular subscription. And I currently have 15.79 points, which sums up to a percentage of roughly 28%. For another subscription, that could be a maximum of 50 points only, because you might not have all the types of resources in there. For example, you're not having a virtual machine, so you won't see the security control that tells you to block management access to your virtual machines. So if you do not have that security control, you're not seeing the 6 or 8 points that it has, and then you might only have 50 or 48 points as a maximum. So that is the secure score for my particular subscription in this case. And then we have the Assessments API, which is a great one, because what we have here is the results of all the recommendations, including the assessment status code, which could be unhealthy, healthy, or not applicable, depending on the resource. So what we're getting here is the assessment result, which always is a recommendation for a particular resource.
Tom, sorry to interrupt. Can you zoom in a little? We have a request from the audience.
Yes. Let me see if I can zoom in Postman. I'm not entirely sure. Let me try that. Well, I have it running on full HD, but it doesn't look like it lets me zoom in. Here we go.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, so yeah, what we're seeing here is the Assessments API with the assessments results. And as I said, that is always the assessment status code for a particular recommendation and a particular resource. Now, what we're adding at the moment, and I'm going to show you that in the Azure Resource Graph, is 2 new fields that we are getting to this particular API and to the assessments. If we look for the unhealthy resources that we have here, then what I did here now is a post request against the Resource Graph API, pulling the same set of information basically, because if we take a look at the body, what we're doing here is we're looking for the security resources with a type Microsoft.security/assessments. And all that information that we just pulled from the Security Assessments API is also stored in the Azure Resource Graph. So if we go to the Azure Resource Graph, we can just put a KQL query against the graph and then get all the information back again. And what we already have here is that we have added 2 new fields. Let me just zoom out again a little bit. Because that, yeah, here we go. We have added 2 new fields, which is the first evaluation date and the status change date. And these 2 time indicators will help you understand when an assessment has been created for a particular resource for the first time and when its status has changed for the last time. So in this particular case, you see that this recommendation has been created on April the 12th, and the status has not changed since then, but I know that my resource has been unhealthy since then. So now I know that, for example, that's a resource that has been unhealthy for more than 2 weeks, and I could now build an automation based on that would just give me an information about, hey, I have a resource that has been unhealthy for a particular time. Please make sure to remediate the particular resource. All right, now let's move over to PowerShell and Azure CLI to see what kind of information we can get from there. In PowerShell, there is a module which is called az.security. And I'm just pulling a list of all the commandlets that we are having in the AZ security module. And you see it's quite a lot of predefined commandlets that you can use when it comes to pulling information for Azure Security Center. And if we start with the first command here, then you see that I'm pulling alert information from Security Center for this particular alert, which is one of the simulated alerts that I have in my environment. That's for Apache ransomware, and it will give you all that information back as an object. And then again, using PowerShell, you can work with all that information object-based. But what you could also do is you could directly from PowerShell run a GET request against an API. For example, in this case, the Secure Scores API. I mean, we have a commandlet for that, but if there would not be a commandlet, you could still use the invoke AZ REST method to pull the information from one of our APIs. And just doing that, here we have the result. So you see that is the content that is coming back, which again is the information that you have just seen before when I've been using Postman. We get a maximum secure score of 56 points. We have a current score of about 16 points, which is 28%. Then going to Azure CLI, again, we have the capability to pull information from Azure Security Center. In this case, I'm using a list of the alerts for Central US, and these are all the alerts for my particular subscription in Central US. And that command, the last one, will give us the same alert that we have queried using the get AZ security alert commandlet in PowerShell. It's the same object that is coming back here. So you see we have quite a lot of different options to get the same information, if it is related to CSPM or if it is related to alerts and CWPP. We can basically get all that information either from Azure Resource Graph or from the REST APIs or using PowerShell or even Azure CLI to work with that in automations, in one-time scripts, or in recurring tasks. And with that, going back to the slide deck and giving it over to Nick again, who will lead you through the automation capabilities that are built into Azure Security Center.
Awesome. That was a sweet demo, Tom. Appreciate it. So cool. Let's talk about continuous export. This was a feature we added recently so that you can automatically and regularly export your ASC data to multiple locations. So, we heard customer feedback about being able to send it to an event hub, and then, the event hub can send it to other types of locations. So specifically, this is how we do something like a SIM integration. So if you wanted to pull the alerts into your SIM, you would export them to an event hub, and then there's a connector typically for that SIM to pull from an event hub. So you can see the different kind of configurations that are supported in this little settings screenshot here. But you can also export them to a log analytics workspace. So if you want to have that data readily available to go run queries against from the log analytics portal or Blade, you can export that data there. And log analytics provides lots of capabilities, such as you can build Azure Monitor workbooks on top of log analytics queries to visualize all that data. You can integrate that data with other data that you might have in, say, Azure Sentinel or other Azure products, so you can combine it using join queries. So there's lots of options that you might want to use a log analytics workspace to store that data. But we made it easy for you to basically continuously export this data with just a couple clicks. You save the setting, and then we will start exporting that data on a regular basis for you. Next slide. Workflow automation is another blade we added to Azure Security Center, and this is where you can automate calling those workflows. Sorry, lost the train of thought there. Workflows against your recommendations or Security Center alert. So you can configure, one-to-many types of automations. You might have one automation that just opens a ServiceNow ticket for every recommendation that gets opened, or every alert that gets opened, or you can configure it and control it down to settings such as, hey, I only want to do it for this specific alert, or this specific recommendation I want to call the playbook. And again, the playbook or workflow is typically a Logic App playbook, and we'll show you a little bit of Logic App playbooks in our demo, and we're actually going to talk about it here in a second. So again, you can do this for security alerts, recommendations, or even regulatory compliance status changes. All right, so let's talk about Logic Apps, one of my favorite tools. So in Logic Apps, we've built a couple built-in Security Center triggers. If you're not familiar with Logic Apps, I'll back up for just a little bit of a second, but basically it's a low code, you can do it in a GUI, you can build a playbook to go run a bunch of steps, right? So a workflow, playbook, I'll use those words interchangeably. But every workflow or playbook you build with Logic Apps has to start with a trigger. Could be a trigger that, hey, I want to run this on a reoccurrence every 1 month, or it could be a trigger like the ones we've built when Azure Security Center an alert is created or triggered. So as soon as we see an ASC alert, we will trigger that playbook. And again, you can run this manually or using the workflow automation, call this playbook automatically. And so there has to be a trigger to start that. So we have a couple triggers, and we just talked about some of these: the alert, the recommendation, and the compliance assessment created. So if one of these things is created or triggered, either manually or automatically, I want to do something in this playbook. So then you would define your next steps. And go to the next slide. And so the nice thing about Logic Apps, there's actually a lot of nice things about Logic Apps, but one, there's lots and lots of native connectors, I think around 150, to all kinds of different services. Like we've talked about ServiceNow, there's Teams, there's Azure Active Directory, there's lots of third parties like Jira, PagerDuty, so maybe you want to call somebody or do something. There's lots you can do with this to automate response actions that you may want to take in there. And you actually do have the capability as well, if you know a little bit of Swagger, is to build a custom connector if you want to integrate with some third-party application that we don't have a connector for. And then there's also a generic HTTP. Go to the next slide, Tom. We'll show a little bit of this. HTTP, so you can invoke any REST API against either Microsoft or any other third-party application that has a REST API. So in your workflow, if you want to call something else that we don't have a connector to, if they have a REST API, we can use it, or you can build a custom connector to do it. So here's a great example of just getting an Azure VM. So maybe we want to get some more data about this VM that was involved in the alert we looked at earlier. So we can just call the management.azure.com. We give it the resource ID, which here is a dynamic content variable inside of Logic Apps. And every step or action inside of a Logic App will have inputs and outputs, and those outputs are typically dynamic content that you can use in later steps. So it makes it really easy to build these. So here we're just going to get a bunch of information about this VM. We could then parse that information. We could do conditions to say, if the VM is a high value asset, take action Y. If it's not, take action Z. So you can make decisions based off of that. All right, so Tom's going to demo some Logic Apps with Azure Security Center.
Yes, thank you. Here we go. So before the session today, I created some alerts in my environment. So I've been basically attacking 2 of my virtual machines, or actually it was 3 or 4 of the machines. And included in this have been some brute force attacks. And what I want to show you right now is, let me just switch that to the right activity start time. I have failed brute force attacks to Linux victim and Contoso Linux victim. And also I had some successful brute force attacks only against the Contoso Linux victim. And if we take a deeper look at the alert description, then again, we see the IP addresses in here. We have seen it already earlier. So we have this IP address from Germany. That is one of the addresses that I've been using today. And we have another IP address, which is this one here, that I've also been using to attack this particular machine. Now, I had not created the workflow automation yet, but I have had the logic app. So what I could do now is I could go to take action, trigger automated response. Then we're going to select the logic app. In this case, it's the block brute force attack logic app, and we could trigger it. Now doing that, we'll start the logic app, pass all the information to the logic app trigger, and then we can process all that information. If we take a look at this logic app, that is this one, it's the block brute force attack. And from the logic, it's not too easy, but it's a few steps that I've created here. But let's just go through it. So we have the logic app trigger. Whenever a security center alert is created or triggered, which means that if it is a workflow automation, then once we have a particular alert coming up in Azure Security Center, the logic app will be triggered automatically. Or triggered means that I have clicked the trigger logic app button right now. Then we have some variable initializations. We are passing the alert body, so all the content that is coming from the trigger is passed to a JSON file. And then in the for each loop, for all the entities, the alert entities that are coming here, we're doing some tests. So first of all, we're looking if that entity is an IP address. So if that value is existing. And if so, we are adding that to an array variable, because that could be one or many. It could be one IP address that has been used for the attack, but it could also be 3 or 4 IP addresses in the same alert that is coming up here. Then again, we are creating a JSON file. And then we are looking if there is an Azure ID, which is then used as a resource ID coming from the alert. We are needing that because we want to initialize a subscription ID. We need the subscription ID to be able to get access to the resource itself. And what we're doing is we're taking the subscription ID out of the resource ID string. And then that is the screenshot that you have seen before. What we're doing here is now we are accessing the compute API to get information about the particular virtual machine. Once we have that, again, we're creating a JSON file. Then we will pull the information from the networking API to get information about the network interface. We are pulling the network security group rules that are existing on the network interface card. And then in the end, what we're doing is a put request against the networking/security rules API, and we will create a new NSG rule that will contain the attacking IP addresses. And if we take a look at the last run that has succeeded today, and that actually succeeded just when I clicked the button, then we will see all the information that has come here. So first of all, we have all the alert information. And if we take a look at the raw outputs, we see that, again, there was an IP address coming. In this case, that was, it was the other alert that I just clicked. That was the IP address coming from Holland. And that is all the alert information that we see in here. Again, we also see the names that have been used for this brute force attack. So that is everything is content from the trigger itself. Then if we go back, we can see that using this HTTP request, we have been accessing the Microsoft.compute/virtual machines API provider to pull the information about the Contoso Linux VM. we have used the networking interface API Microsoft.network/network interfaces to pull the information about the virtual machine's network interface card. We did the same for the NSG rules, for existing rules, because we wanted to know which rule has been existing already, so we can then decide what is the new rule that has to be created, and that is the rule that we just created. It's a deny rule, priority 101 for this IP address and for basically all destination ports. And if we now take a look at the virtual machine, then we will see that exactly this rule has been created. It's this one, priority 101 for the IP address 40, 113, and so on and so forth. And again, we could also have the same logic app running directly from Azure Security Center when the alert is popping up, and that is what we are doing within the scope of workflow automation. And what I also prepared already is a workflow automation for 2 subscriptions. And if we take a look at that, we will see that whenever there is a threat detection alert that contains the name brute, and that could be a failed or a successful brute force attack against SSH, RDP, or even a SQL server, and we are selecting all the severities, then we will run the block brute force attack logic app. So when it comes to protecting your environment in a reactive approach, once there is an alert, you want to do something, then workflow automations are a good way for you to go. If you want to have something done automatically, if you want the SOC team or the SOC analyst to be the one to click the button, then again, you can also do that by not creating a workflow automation, but just to create the logic app and then to give the person the capability to trigger the logic app by clicking the button directly from the alert. Now, when it comes to cloud security posture management, again, we can use some logic apps that might help you. If you, for example, if you do not have access that you would need to do something. In this case, we have a logic app here to request a resource exemption. In order to be able to create a resource exemption, you need a high level of access in Azure Security Center. So someone who has only, for example, security reader access, they might be responsible for reviewing the configuration, but they're not allowed to change any configuration. So they're not allowed to create a resource exemption. But again, what they could do is they could go to the recommendation, select the resource, and then click the trigger logic app button. And then this would be the logic app to be triggered. In this case, what we're doing is we're basically getting the security contacts for a particular subscription, and then we're sending a Teams message and an email to that set of security contacts, and that email will contain some information, including, you can see it here, the resource itself, a deep link, information about the recommendation, and so on. So once you request the creation of a resource exemption, a responsible person will get that email. They can click the link and they are immediately redirected to Azure Security Center to the recommendation for this particular resource, and then they can select the resource and exempt the resource from being assessed. So you see, basically it's only about fantasy. The ideas that you might have when it comes to creating an automation, you will have all the capabilities using logic apps, because with logic apps, you can basically connect to any environment. And if there is not a predefined connector, you can either create your own connectors, or you can just use the generic HTTPE connector to pull or to push information from or to one of the REST APIs that are available in Azure Security Center. And with that being said, let's go back to the slide deck and take a look at when to use which automation capability. Basically, you can use any of those for all of the different aspects of automation. But it is best practice to use PowerShell and Azure CLI for one-time tasks. If you want to set an easy setting, if you want to pull or retrieve information from Azure Security Center, or for example, if you want to export the data to a CSV file, then PowerShell would be the way to go. PowerShell comes with the AZ security module, and with the corresponding commandlets. And so you can basically use all the goodness in PowerShell to pull the information, to work with that information, and to export the information to whatever service or file format you want. The APIs you learned about, the REST APIs and the Security Graph API, and also the APIs that Azure Resource Graph is coming with, the REST APIs are high code interfaces, so they are good to be used in your own applications and services, but you can also use them inside of Logic Apps, because Logic Apps do not have connectors to everything, but with the APIs, you can get all the information that you need. And then we are at Logic Apps, and Logic Apps are great for building automations around recurring tasks, but also for one-time tasks if you want to have something to be fired when you need it, like the block brute force attack alert, a block brute force attack alert automation that we have created that can be run automatically, but it can also be fired when you need it. All the automations that I showed you today can be found in the Azure Security Center GitHub community, and that is the one-stop shop for automations around Security Center. You will find a lot of automations in there that have been created by our team, by the wider CXE org, by the product team itself, but also from people outside of Microsoft. And this is what it is actually meant to be. It is a community repository, and we want your automations in there as well. So if you have a good idea for creating an automation, hey, go ahead, feel free, reach out to me, reach out to us, send a pull request, and we're happy to merge your automation into the ASC GitHub community. And with that, I want to open it up for a Q&A. Thank you very much for attending today's session, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you to both of you, Nick and Tom. And although the team has been taking care of all of the questions, I just wanted to see maybe you have something to add further to the ones that were answered already.
I'm just scrolling through here. Let's see here. I think we answered most of them. We shared the links for the samples that were in there. If anybody else wants to pop a couple last minute questions in there before we finish the call. Maybe Valen, want to wrap it up, and we'll see what if anybody posts anything in the next minute or two.
Sounds good. I would first like to announce, due to the unforeseen logistical issues, last minute change that is we made for tomorrow's session of Better Together with Azure Security Center and Defender for Endpoint, which will be postponed for later this summer. And instead, we will have a live session on demystifying Azure Defender once for all. So if you have already registered for tomorrow's session and are planning to attend, there are no actions for you to take. That is, if you would like to attend the newly added session for the Demystifying Azure Defender once for all. And we apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused you. Also, I would like to remind the listeners that the best way to ensure that you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements, please visit our landing page at aka.ms/security-community. And while you're there, you'll find easy ways to navigate and find the resources and learning content relevant to our security products and the communities. And I would suggest a good start would be just simply browsing over the bit-sized product videos we made, Ninja trainings, recordings of past webinars, the GitHub communities, and there's more there. So we'd love also to hear your feedback on how we can improve these webinars. Please take a minute by submitting your feedback at aka.ms/security webinar feedback. Is there any other questions coming in? Yep.
Yeah, so I'll try to run through a couple of these. Some of them are a little more complex. So someone asked, can we connect on-prem firewall and block IPs there using Logic Apps? And is there one available in the GitHub? So I don't think we have one in the GitHub. On-prem firewalls are a little more complex because you need to connect to on-prem, and specifically, does the firewall have some type of API that can be called? Now, there's several ways that you could get around this. You can use Azure Automation to run a PowerShell script on-prem, and you can call that Azure Automation from the Logic app. But we did a sample one which uses an Azure function to call a Palo Alto REST API and add an IP to a block role. So you can, as long as there's some way to access that firewall remotely via either REST API or a command line tool, and then you can basically call that from the logic app. How do you do logging and debugging in those logic apps while developing those features? Tom, I don't know if you want to flip over while I talk about this, but as Tom showed, you can go back and see previous runs. And there's actually a really cool button there. If Tom can share the previous runs. You can see that resubmit. Oh, go back to the previous run. Yeah, just click on it. So here you can see like all the steps, what happened, what was the inputs, what was the outputs, and get additional detail for each one of them. And then if you want to try to trigger something again, you don't have to go back to Azure Security Center. You can actually hit that resubmit button right there on the logic app run, and it'll rerun it using the same inputs to the trigger that started it. And so you can kind of rerun those, and there's no like live debugging per se, but you kind of have to run it, see what happens, make some changes, run it, see what happens, make some changes.
And actually what you're seeing here is my debugging from today. So I've been working with an automation, and this is exactly what I do. So once I have triggered the automation by Azure Security Center for the first time, I mean, that's a bad example at the moment because it's a recurrence trigger. But if that would be a Security Center trigger, then you can just click the resubmit and you will get all the same information. So even if the alert is no longer existing in your environment, if that has been triggering the logic app, you can still work with the same set of information and then fine tune your automation later on and debug it using that information. So that is pretty common for me to do, because it is a good way to have the same information every time when you run the logic app.
Then there was a question, Tom, I don't know if you know the answer. How do you access Azure/PowerShell CLI through automation accounts? I think you can do it through Azure Automation, yes. I know you can run all the PowerShell commandlets in Azure Automation. I don't know about CLI.
That would be my answer as well. So with PowerShell that is easy to do, but I'm not sure with CLI, because at the end of the day, you need to authenticate CLI against Azure Active Directory, and I'm not sure if they have a capability to run it not in person, but like in an automation account. I'm not sure about that. But I'm usually not using Azure CLI. I'm a PowerShell guy, although I'm using the MacBook here. But I'm usually having either PowerShell or directly requesting the access to my APIs and then pull information from there.
Awesome. And if we didn't get to your question, sorry, we're right at time. So please post those in the tech community, and someone will help answer them. And I really do appreciate everybody joining us today. Hopefully this will help you improve your security in your environment using Azure Security Center.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And of course, I want to thank all of you for being part of our community and for joining us on these webinars. And we hope to see you next time. Goodbye.
Take care. Bye-bye.